We've spoken to Mike Bell because he has set up an all-party parliamentary group with an interest in men's affairs. And we're very interested to hear how he's achieved this and his views about how to organise and be effective rather than simply having conversations between those who already agree with each other. This is an interesting conversation because the key really has to be to make a difference rather than just keep talking about the problems repeatedly in the same way. Well, Mike, I think the first thing we want to ask you then is about how you got involved with this movement to support men. What did you find when you first got interested in this?
Well, what happened was I just started contacting people
Right.
and to say, I'm interested in getting involved in some way. And in some places, people told me, oh, if I said something like, let's make some short videos about each of the issues, the response was, that's a waste of time. Or if I said, are you contacting MPs? And they say, that's been tried and it doesn't work. And another bunch of people wanted to edit the Wikipedia pages on
Right.
domestic abuse to make them gender neutral, and seemed unable to actually get around to it. It was lots of planning, but no action.
So a kind of
And
defeatist mood amongst
well, yes,
people
a
by the
sort
sound
of
of it.
an attitude that somehow the system, there's this sort of big, huge system out there, and it's full of evil people, and that we can't do anything because they will stop us. There's this concept of they, um, again, a sort of powerful movement. Um, and what struck me, so that was about 3 years ago, so let's say around about 2018.
Yeah.
But in the early 1980s, when I got involved in Green politics, I joined the SDP and then the Lib Dems. And initially, I'd been going along to Green groups and a meeting. And when I started to do that, they would tell me that I was selling out to the system and that the real people were doing this, and that, and that MPs were only in it for themselves and they were making these decisions which destroyed the environment and therefore they were evil people.
So a similar set
And
of attitudes, really.
yeah, it was a sort of hang about. I've been here before because I remember probably around about 1983 or something like that, after the SDP had been running a little while, they had an economics conference, and I'd just started a little group called SDP Greens, and we'd have a sort of a stall at a conference and get Greenpeace to give a talk and this sort of thing. And I asked a question of the economic spokesman, which he seemed unable to answer. And then I saw him at the stall the following day, and I said, "Were you interested in that question?" And he sort of leaned towards me. He said, "Fascinating." He said, "Do you know, I've never thought of that." There was a sort of a green question about whether or not economic growth was a good idea. He just never thought of the idea that economic growth might not be a good idea in every circumstance if it
Right.
damaged the environment. And I thought, that's extraordinary. He said, the problem with being an MP is you're so focused on the agenda for this week, what's in the newspapers and the letters from your constituents, we hardly have time to think about the future. And I had a number of experiences where gradually realized that I didn't need to campaign on green issues. I just needed to provide the information and then get on the working group that wrote the policy paper and that
But the
sort of thing.
information has to go to the key people, has to go to the right people.
Yes, exactly. But it was an information provision rather than an argument.
Mm.
That is, when I said something like, at the time there was a problem with ozone layer or something like that. And they might not know anything about the ozone layer. It's not that they were opposing whatever international legislation on ozone was coming up. They just didn't know anything about it. So, and I think the situation is the same today, that a lot of people on men's issues, because we as individuals have been around it or have been really hurt by something or other and have started to look at the facts and figures, we think that everybody knows what these things are, and that the reason why the parliamentarians are making all this bad legislation is because they're bad people. And I think that this is another fundamental error in campaigning, is to believe that the journalists and the politicians and what have you are evil or bad people.
So because, what have you done? What have you been doing then, Mike? Applying this to the men's activist lobby?
Well, for instance, with the domestic abuse bill, we've been following that quite closely, and then just doing something. So I think when it was published in January 2019, I was in contact with Mark Brooks at the Mankind Initiative. Yeah. And I said, can I help in any way? He said, George, can you look through the press reporting of the publication of the bill to see how gender biased it was? And so that was my first awakening, is that 12 out of 12 newspapers and TV news reports reported domestic abuse as though it only affected women. And in fact, only one source mentioned the fact that a third of it was men. And that was just the BBC giving the figures. But everybody else was talking about it as a biased. So then I wrote into the select committee. And after they published their list of, once you've written in, that they published the list. To my amazement, only 4 groups had written in. I'm thinking, this is crazy. This is the domestic abuse bill. We know that it is heavily gendered biased. We know there's probably a big lobby behind it. And yet nobody's even bothering to write in to the select committee when they've asked for submissions. So I'm thinking, with all due respect to it, there's all these people running conferences and making videos and talking to each other and getting upset, but they're not doing the simple, basic, available things, even never mind the unavailable things.
Which is right to the select committee, for example. And
yes, I mean, if they've asked for evidence, then, and there seemed to be no organisation doing that. So that's when I started a little website called Equi-Law, just with the idea of, that what we want is laws to be gender neutral. Very soon, I realised, with help from Rick Bradford, that very few laws are written in a gender biased way because it's actually against the law to do so. So generally speaking, you'll find the wording of a bill is gender neutral, even this new domestic abuse bill. So they always publish a guidance document with it, so we've been looking at that as well, and all the gendered stuff is in the guidance. So whenever an MP, the sort of Jess Phillips of this world, were putting forward a motion which tried to make the bill gender biased, then she was turned down, but was promised that it would go in the guidance. And at the moment, it's still in the guidance. So we've been engaging with the guidance process. So how do you do that? Well, send an email saying, how do I get involved in the guidance? There was a Zoom call with several people where the team putting together the guidance were wanting to talk to men's issues people. So, I mean, it's not that it came to anything. It's not that I can say, oh, this has happened as a result. But if we don't do these things, then it's just that what happens is government legislation is dominated by the people who do. And in gender parity, we've got a little project which we're in the middle of at the moment, is working out what the size of the lobby group is. Because we noticed in the debate in the House of Lords particularly, that peers were receiving quite a lot of briefings. So when you look at the briefings from, say, Women's Aid and Respect, and also from the victims commissioners, you find there's a constant narrative there. That is, there's quite a lobby industry, and that if we don't do at least a tenth of that, then they will get what they want.
Do you think they're all working together, Mike?
We have no proof of that. They don't actually need to be sitting down in a room having a little conspiracy. No. Because I suppose this is something we've come into more recently, is that you only have to sign up to the postmodernist ideology, and it all falls into place. That is, in what you might call the Western European empirical tradition, or whatever it is. If you wanted to know something about, if you wanted to know whether domestic abuse was a gendered crime, that you look at the figures and work out whether that was the case or not. With the Ethnic Disparities Commission, in their report, what they've done is they've asked the Office of National Statistics and what have you for the figures, which shows convincingly that you cannot say that BAME people are disadvantaged, because the general white population comes in the middle. The most advantaged people are some Indians and East Asians in terms of education.
We're rather taken with what Eric Weinstein says about conspiracy theories, that they really should be called conspiracy hypotheses, which means that you test them. That is, there may be a conspiracy, but you don't know if there's a conspiracy or not unless you test your hypothesis, and which means you do have to do something and intervene rather than just assume that this is what's happening.
The starting point is that society is racist and sexist. Therefore, by definition, domestic abuse is gendered. You don't have to provide any figures for it, because it just is, because that's the way the world is. And if a black man is killed by a white policeman in America, then Britain is institutionally racist. So to get back to the lobby groups, it doesn't require these groups to sit down in a room and agree the party line, because they know the party line. The party line is women are the victims and men are awful.
They must hear these other things being said, though, Mike. They must hear mankind talking about some of the numbers that they have. They must hear people like Deborah Powney, I imagine, and know that they exist even.
And they must know Rick's statistics, for example.
Empathy Gap, I would have thought, his book, The Empathy Gap, they just ignore it, do they? Or do they think that all those people are mad?
Well, for instance, there's a very revealing video clip of Adrian Barnett. I don't know, do you know that name?
Yeah.
A very influential feminist academic. She's giving a talk. You can see it on YouTube in Dubai, I think, in which she explains what her ideology is. And she specifically describes the empirical tradition as patriarchal. That is, that if you're putting forward these views, you've simply been caught by the patriarchy, and therefore they can dismiss it. As you see in the press with this commission, the members of the commission, there are 12 commissioners, only one is white. Every single one is a non-white British academic or expert in some way, and yet the people opposing them can simply state that they're racist without any evidence whatsoever.
It's extraordinary, because yesterday we were interviewing Maggie Oliver. I don't know if you know her, the ex-detective who was involved with the Rochdale scandal with the grooming gangs, and we were talking about that. And here are a lot of mainly white girls, white children, who've been seriously affected by being raped repeatedly and sexually assaulted and groomed. And yet none of these people that you're talking about seem to be standing up for them. And we were just wondering why that was yesterday when we were talking. I don't know if you've got any ideas about that.
Not specifically. I'm not an expert in that at all. I think that the failure of the police and the local authorities and what have you to deal with the evidence at the time was probably not postmodernist ideology. It was more this kind of hypersensitivity to not wanting to upset the ethnic minority, and it's sort of like a hyper politeness which we do.
And yet we hear nothing much from the feminist activist people, if one could I don't know if that's a polite way to talk about it, even sensible.
Women. What about just calling them women?
Because intervening with the independent investigation of sexual abuse of children, the Baroness J process, in which they were very careful to avoid directly investigating the abuse going on in places like Rochdale, and instead concentrated on South Wales, where it's not really a very big deal. So you don't hear much when it comes to...
Just wondering why women who are very actively, eager to tell everyone how bad it is, they don't mention the fact that these girls are having a nightmare, an existence which is a total nightmare, and that goes unnoticed, unremarked upon, whereas they have maybe an experience of being wolf whistled, or maybe have a rude comment said to them. And that seems to be something which, they talk about, they're traumatized by it. Well, what about these girls? What about what's happening to these girls? And I would wonder if it were their children, that they would be so quiet about it and acquiesce to the idea that this shouldn't be looked into. I'm sure they wouldn't be saying that. And I mean, Maggie Oliver was very clear yesterday, and she's suggesting it's a class issue. And I think she's probably right.
But what I can talk about is how we can engage with the...
Yes.
But you're saying that you have written to the Select Committee, and yet you're not sure that there's been an impact. You have written and you have intervened. Are you seeing evidence of an impact?
Well, of course, it's incredibly difficult to tell. Engaging with the domestic abuse bill was our first effort, which part of which involves working out what the system is. So you get the first reading, and then it goes to committee, and then we have when do you get the amendments, and what happens in the Lords, and all that sort of thing. And so we've been learning about that, but also we've been doing things like the Law Commission came out with a hate crime.
Sorry, this was the hate crime
consultation from the Law Commission.
Right.
This is a second area, quite separate from the domestic abuse bill.
Yes.
And in the section on sex and gender, they want to decide whether or not to make misogyny a hate crime. Now, you would think that this would start off with some statistics which showed what percentage of bad things that happen to women by men are motivated by hatred or misogyny, hatred of women or misogyny. But there isn't any at all. There are simply references, and this is where you start to go, oh my God, this is far deeper than we imagined. You find departments in British universities which are overtly feminist, writing papers which are then referenced as though they were fact. So we stumbled upon the same stuff as the, what are those Pluckrose and Lindsay
Oh, yes.
and the
Yes.
grievance
Boghossian.
studies,
Yeah.
their hoax papers. You go,
Yeah.
you find, oh my God, here is a paper which could be described as a hoax. That is, it's got the same characteristics. It's in a feminist journal, quoted in the Law Commission as
Yeah.
proof that men are motivated by misogyny. Completely throwing aside the fact that 57%, or just a bit less than 60% of domestic violence involves both parties. That is, what's happened is a row has got out of hand. Now, there's no way that you could describe that as misogyny. They're having a row and it gets out of hand. And we know that people who come from families where there was more violence are more likely to be violent in those circumstances. Again, it's an inherited characteristic, not misogyny. And so the figures simply do not support this idea. The figures suggest, the best figures we can come up with is, say, about 3% of the violence against women is motivated by hatred of women.
One of the things we keep coming across, Mike, is a kind of absence of interest in evidence. That is,
yes.
that both in the family courts, where there is often very little evidence because it's a private affair that's gone on between two people, and there may not be any third parties to confirm anybody's account of what's happened, but also in the committees and so on that we hear reporting. There seems to be very little interest in actually looking for facts. And actual evidence to guide decision making.
I wouldn't say that it was universal. That is, I think many people in public life at least pay lip service to the idea that we ought to have evidence, and certainly that they're at least not ideologically opposed to the idea. I mean, as a former science teacher, I am brutally aware that the education system did not prepare most people to engage with evidence. That is, even as a science teacher, I know that we taught them how to do a fair test in a physics or chemistry experiment where you control variables. But in any social or biological system, you have to have large numbers and statistics and percentages and
control groups or comparison in some way.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
So and similarly in a court of law, you have rules about evidence, or historians use evidence. But I agree, it is extremely worrying the erosion of this general assumption that that's the approach we would take, because in a way it's what's created the modern world. It's starting in the late 17th, 18th century, where are we, sort of 1760s or something like that. You start to get the scientific and revolution, and then later on you start to get evidence-based medicine.
Well, that was quite recent, actually, Mike. Evidence-based medicine. That came in long after I started in medicine. And I can remember how very depressing and boring it was to start thinking about evidence-based medicine rather than just getting on and enjoying yourself, doing things which were interesting. And I think that is the problem with evidence, is that actually it's boring. Gathering the statistics, doing it properly, recording it, analysing it. And you start depending on geeky people who understand about how to use numbers and how to test for probabilities, etc. And that, of course, is not a skill amongst the people who've graduated with history degrees or English degrees or social work degrees or whatever it is that brings them into politics or activism. They're not the people who actually are interested in the numbers. They've been much more interested in debate and discussion. So there may be a cultural problem.
Yeah. Well, I agree. We certainly, I mean, I was reflected when, just 30 years ago in the Green Movement, or might it be 40 years ago now, scary, that one had to explain things like global warming or acid rain or biodiversity or the life cycle of great whales or something like that.
Yes.
That people are not naturally, and of course, as more and more people go to university, more people do the non-evidence-based subjects.
Yes.
And so we get more and more graduates who have graduated with a mindset which is not focused on evidence.
I think we have to be kind. My mother didn't really believe in evolution. I don't think she was unique in her generation of being skeptical about Darwin and this, and so it's not that deeply rooted, the idea that you should live your life on the basis of actually having some evidence to guide your decisions. And people don't really like it. The algorithm, algorithms become a dirty word in some areas.
Yes, there was an interesting case last summer where the government was supposed to have applied an algorithm to GCSE results.
Yeah.
And there was a huge outcry.
No, you need the feelings of the teachers were more important. We rely on the feelings.
What they didn't say is the algorithm is used every year anyway. It's been used for decades to make sure that. Otherwise, if you get a relatively easier exam one year than the year before, you need to adjust the grade boundaries so that roughly the same number of people get a grade A. Well, that's just done by this algorithm. So anyway.
So the world we live in is a playground for people who don't want to bother with evidence. But what direction are you going in with the work you're doing? Where are you heading now?
Okay, well, what happened was in November last year, there was an International Men's Day debate in the House of Commons. It was quite short, but what struck me is this new guy, Ben Bradley. And I was immediately on the phone to my colleagues going, did you hear Ben Bradley? I mean, he's asking why we don't have a minister for men. And I was just very impressed with this guy. And I noticed that the House of Commons Library, who are a source of evidence, I bet if I were to meet the people who work in the House of Commons Library, they would be in agreement with us. That is, their job is to dig out the facts. They'd produced a briefing, which I'm not sure how many MPs had actually read it, but it's actually quite a good briefing of men's issues. So there was that. And then at the beginning of December, I got an email from a guy I'd never met before, Chris Badley, who said, how about we see if we can start an APPG?
What is that?
APPG, that's an all-party parliamentary group in Parliament. It's a voluntary group. It doesn't have any official status, if you know what I mean. But so long as you can get a certain number of MPs or peers, as long as there's a spread across the parties, you've got to have at least one member of the governing party and one member of the main opposition party. You can form a group, and there are hundreds of these actually. So they're all like special interest groups. So you might have the APPG on Afghanistan or on football, for instance, and they don't have an official status, but it's an interesting way of bringing people together on a particular topic, and then the output from the APPG will have a bit more status than a letter from me. And also, it might be possible at some stage to invite the minister or write to the minister, that sort of, or publish something. So that was, I think, around about, I can't remember, December the 7th or something like that. So I asked around. Everybody sort of said, "Well, that sounds a good idea, but we haven't. Why has nobody tried that?" And I thought, well, I know why I haven't tried it, for the same reason they haven't tried most things. It's because they think it can't be done. And luckily, sort of remembering what MPs were like 30 years ago, I'm sure they're rough. I thought they would be roughly the same. That is, MPs are people who wanted to do this strange job, who wanted to get selected by their local party organisation, who wanted to knock on doors, who wanted to get the votes of ordinary people, and now find themselves in Parliament with a diary which is bulging at the seams. My almost universal experience is that people went into politics with high motives. Some of them may get corrupted, but the vast majority of people genuinely believe they're there to make the world a better place. They're not evil people there for their own profit. If they were there for themselves, they'd do something else. They'd go into business. But anyway, so a little bit of conversation. Wrote to Philip Davis, who's been this stalwart MP standing up for men's issues almost alone for about 6 years or so. It was quite clear from the International Men's Day debate that more people were prepared to stand up. Oh, not just that. Last July, in the domestic abuse bill, several men spoke about male victims. That there seemed to be perhaps a little shift in the tide. The taboo seemed to be lifting. That is, they weren't being ridiculed by certain other people for standing up for men. So I just started emailing MPs and peers. I must have sent 2,000 emails. And dialogue, as soon as somebody responds.
Yeah.
I've had conversations with people who didn't join. I had people who joined and left. But roundabout by mid-February, so it's we only started trying just after Christmas, and by mid-February we had enough people.
That's wonderful.
And I think to everybody's surprise. And we've just had our second meeting. So, I mean, it's not spectacularly successful, but people turn up. Certainly, we had a Sonia Sheljean from Lads Need Dads. I don't know whether you know Sonia. You should definitely you should definitely have her on record. So what she does is she links fatherless boys with male mentors, trains the mentors.
Yes, I have heard of her. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, quite extraordinary, quite utterly. Sorry, I didn't mean to get emotional, but she understands. She gets inside the head of boys. She knows where they are, teenage boys, which is a very hard thing to know, I think. So
don't you remember, Mike?
Pardon?
You were there. Do you remember?
Well, yes. Also, I was a school teacher, and you can see what boys are like at the age of 15 or so. It's a very confusing time. Anyway, so the questions asked by the parliamentarians were very good and supportive, and one MP quizzing her because he got a project with a similar idea in his own constituency, and he wanted to know from our own experience what worked best. That's all. I thought, this is exactly what I thought.
Yeah,
is they just want good information.
Excellent.
And so
that's very encouraging. Yeah.
And I was thinking about, why did most people think that it couldn't be done, and why did I think that it could be done? And I think that there's some sort of underlying assumptions that I have about not being too goal orientated, not saying what I want to achieve is X. It's like to have the goal in mind, but just take it one step at a time. You know what I mean? So first write to Philip Davis and see whether he thinks it's a good idea. Philip Davis says, yes, that's a good idea. So next thing, so then we start down downloading the email addresses of MPs from the Parliament website and putting them on a spreadsheet, and then we start writing, and then we get no result from here, and we get a positive result there, and then we ask somebody what they think, and
so it's hard slog, really, you're talking about, Mike. Hard slog.
Well, I think it's just like a sort of. It's not really a hard slog.
I think it would be in a lot of people's eyes, though. It would. I think people would think, "Oh, I'd rather be doing something else than downloading masses of names and putting them on the spreadsheet." No, I do actually. I mean, I agree with you. I think you should do that. I'm all for hard work and getting on with stuff like that. But a lot of people don't seem to have the appetite for it.
But it's good if somebody will do it, as you've done.
Yeah.
I don't think the problem is that they don't want to do it.
Right.
I think a lot of people want to be effective, but they don't go about it in the right way.
Right.
And I think that's a really important thing for the men's issues movement to be aware of, that actually there is some self-sabotage going on. I mean, the sort of self-sabotage, it's not just in the men's movement, it's a kind of fundamentalism. That is, what you're saying is not exactly what I think, therefore you're the enemy.
That's not helpful, is it?
Whereas the women don't seem to operate like that at all. If you know what I mean. The people in refuge and the supportive MPs, and they seem to sort of be able to work a lot more. I don't know whether it's true. Obviously, I don't know them, and I'm not there at their meetings or their discussions. But there does seem to be a sort of unified front. I remember thinking after various conversations that it was like that scene in The Life of Brian, where the Front for the Liberation of Judea is absolutely hates the Judean Liberation Front, and I did hear a story about there was an Islamic fundamentalist uprising in Algeria, which eventually petered out, and the suggestion was that there was so much infighting between different factions that they actually killed each other rather than.
Well, we're trying not to do that. I mean, our experience has been that we are speaking to people who are very interested in defending, men who've been victimized in one way or another, and get them on an equal footing with women. But that's, as you say, it's a lot of conversation within a closed group of people who are already converted to the cause, and reaching out is clearly really important, and leading that process is an excellent project.
I mean, an area which I just haven't had time to do, but which could easily be done, is we know that there are endless press reports which are gender biased, and demonizing men or boys, and we often see them. But does anybody engage with the journalist? I think there's an assumption that because the journalist has written an article which contains this gender bias, that they must be a gender biased journalist. But I just don't think this is true. As with the MPs, I think you'll find that they've just been going along with the culture, because most people pick up whatever they believe from the world around them.
Yeah.
If somebody grows up in a Christian family, they may become a Christian without ever deciding to be a Christian or a Muslim, or a victim feminist, or any of these other religions.
Well, Mike, thank you for sharing all your experience, because I think it's really important to be talking about what people can do and how to move things forward and actually make a difference, rather than simply bemoaning the problem and keeping on rehearsing the problem. So it's very encouraging to hear that you can make progress, and it's a slow and steady process, but ultimately it seems to be rewarding if you get a result and there's a group of people working together to make a difference. So we need to thank you, Mike, for your time. And
do come back and tell us how things go.
We
That
want
would
to
be very interesting.
keep track of the project.
what you need to be aware of is the door is open, but nobody's pushing.
Yeah, excellent.
That's a
Excellent.
nice ending.
Well, thank you, Mike.
Thank
Thanks
you
very
very
much
much, Mike.
indeed.